I'm sure that you've been hearing that the Z Fold 6 is an iterative update, but is it really? I mean, yeah, it has a bunch of the same specs as the Z Fold 5, but in every other industry, I never see a spec improvement along with a design change in the same year. It just doesn't really happen. Granted, Samsung has been using the same specs for a few years now, so it kind of feels like they should have updated a while ago, but this phone isn't without its improvements. Besides the obvious design change, there are some physical improvements that were made to the phone. In this video, I'm going to go over the changes a little more closely, and I'm also going to point out what I think should be changed in the next generation. Before I get started, remember that clicking on the like and subscribing will really help this channel out. Now let's get started. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is the design change, and this is the most obvious one for obvious reasons. It has been changed pretty dramatically and now has a boxier look, which I think goes way better with a foldable phone than the rounded edges of the previous one. I don't remember if I mentioned this in a previous video, but I definitely thought it back when I had the Z Fold 3. And the boxier design just makes sense for a foldable phone, mainly because one of the sides is going to be stuck as a squared off edge anyway. So why not make the other side that you can control squared off as well? That way it's more symmetrical. And Samsung went ahead and made this change, and I think it really paid off. Now, of course, with a boxier design, it's going to be a little bit less comfortable, but Samsung didn't do what they did with the S24 Ultra or the Ultra lineup for the last few generations, in which they have a completely flat edge along with a rounded edge, which kind of made it a sharp corner. With the Z Fold 6, even though it is squared off, the corner is still slightly rounded, so it's not as bad as the Ultra models. So in terms of comfort, I would say it's definitely not as comfortable as the rounded edges of the Pixel Fold and the Razr Plus, but it's definitely not uncomfortable either. It's not bad at all. And overall, it looks better in my opinion. If we turn the phone over, we'll see that Samsung went with a slit for the speakers rather than the grill they had before. And that just adds to the clean look that the Z Fold 6 already has. And going to the flat rails is a definite good call, because with foldable phones, having the flat rails helps to keep it feeling like a single piece when it's folded. When you have the rounded rails, although it is a bit more comfortable, you do feel the separation between the two halves a bit more, and it kind of disrupts the comfort or the feeling of holding a single device. And you could kind of tell like you're holding a foldable device. And when you look between the two halves, you'll see that Samsung adopted the same design choice as the OnePlus Open, which was the best one that had been created up to that point. So they went away from having the two bumpers, one on the top and one on the bottom. And instead they went with a fully symmetrical bumper that when you close it, seals up the phone pretty much all the way, except for a couple small spots in the ends near the hinge. The main difference between the OnePlus Open and the Z Fold 6's take on the same design for the bumper is that the Z Fold 6 has a much thinner space between it, so it meshes a little bit better than the OnePlus Open does. And in sticking with the outside, looking at the cameras, there weren't any spec upgrades really, but it is looking a little bit different. They added a larger ring around it, and I think it might have been to kind of make it look like a bigger sensor than it really is. But either way, it kind of goes a bit better with the phone and makes it look a little bit more modern, since the newer phones are having larger sensors, and just keeps it up with at least the looks of it. But unfortunately, no actual spec upgrades for the telephoto and main sensors, which would be awesome, but just not there. Another physical design improvement is the overall thickness of the phone. So the Z Fold 6 is at 12.1 millimeter, which is still not the thinnest out there by a long shot, but it's over 1.3 millimeters thinner than the Z Fold 5, I think the exact number is. It's not really something you're going to notice if you're not comparing it next to each other. Overall, I think that the thickness is just fine the way it is. Obviously, thinner would be nicer to match the, the standard or the large slab phones that are currently out. But we're using a foldable phone, and when you unfold it, it's way thinner than those phones anyway. So I'm not going to complain about having a slightly thicker phone than a regular slab phone. And that kind of goes hand in hand with the next improvement, which is the weight of the phone. And it's down to 239 grams, which is equivalent to the lighter version of the OnePlus Open. It's at that point where it's matching the heavier slab phones, which is kind of where it needs to be. It is a bigger phone than the slab phones, so keeping the weight around that weight range is going to be just fine. So the 239 grams is actually a very comfortable weight for this phone, and it feels very comfortable when you're holding it for a long time. And even more importantly, they didn't reduce the battery size to save weight. It actually kept the same battery size. And that's important for this phone specifically because it doesn't have the biggest battery, especially for a foldable phone. Next, I'm moving to the hinge, and this was one of the major improvements I think that helped to keep the phone as slender as it is, but also letting them increase the width of the cover display. And so the hinge, I would say, is a lower profile hinge, but the performance is pretty much exactly the same. It's very smooth, it stays where you need it to stay, and it actually has an added dust resistance now, which, the Z Fold 5 was only water resistant. So along with having a thinner hinge, it actually has additional protection, and it's allowing the phone to stay narrow while widening the screen at the same time. And that goes hand in hand with the cover display, which I consider to be a major improvement. I know that the difference in width doesn't seem like a lot, but when you compare it next to each other, it's actually a pretty big difference. So when I compare the Z Fold 5 and Z Fold 6 top to bottom, and I line up the screens, I see that the Z Fold 6 is the width of the Z Fold 5 screen plus the entire left-hand border. And that's actually a pretty good amount considering that the phone itself is not really much thicker or wider to begin with. So basically, Samsung was able to widen the screen by just reducing the borders all the way around it. And it shows it's actually at a point where it's very comfortable to use the way it is. It's still narrow enough where you have a very comfortable grip, but the screen is wide enough where it's comfortable to use. So in terms of the sweet spot for the screen width, I would say that it's rubbing against the lower end of the sweet spot. So I don't see, and I don't really want Samsung to make the phone any wider. I'd rather them just focus on making the borders thinner and increasing the width size in that way. So if you have the Z Fold 5, it's not going to be a night and day difference, but if you're at the Z Fold 3 or older, the 2 or the original, it's definitely going to be a massive difference. Because I moved from the Z Fold 3 to the Z Fold 5 and it felt pretty big. And going from the Z Fold 5 to the Z Fold 6 feels about the same as when I made that jump previously. So obviously going from an older generation, the difference in width is going to make a bigger difference than just one generation. So now I'm going to open the phone and we're looking at the main screen. There were a couple of improvements here. One being the max brightness was brought up to 2600 nits, which is always welcomed because, the brighter the screen is, the more you're going to be able to use it in sunlight and in bright areas. Never a bad thing to upgrade the brightness on the screen. The other thing is the crease, and that wasn't improved too much, but it was a slight improvement. It's definitely not to the point of the OnePlus Open, actually not really anywhere near, but it is improved, so it's a little bit better. One aspect that I found very important because it made the split screen mode a little bit better to use in the portrait orientation is that the overall width is also a bit wider on the main screen. So with the Z Fold 5, I felt like it was a little bit too narrow to do the side-by-side in portrait mode, so I would always have to flip it to a landscape and then use the phone that way. With the Z Fold 6, it's just wide enough that I could keep it in portrait orientation and still have a good experience using split screen. So the slight increase in width actually made a pretty big difference in usability and user experience on the main screen. The next thing is something that I'm glad they got rid of because to me it looked ugly and didn't really even make sense to me. So I already mentioned it with the phone closed, stating that the Z Fold 6 took the bumper design or adopted the bumper design from the OnePlus Open. And what this did is that it allowed them to remove the ugly bumpers that they had in the top and the bottom corners of the Z Fold 5. So it's going to give it a way cleaner look and feel on the borders when the screen is open. It just goes with the overall minimalist, clean design that the Z Fold 6 has, and it was just that small touch that made a visually big difference. Next, I'm going to be moving to the software, and we're already using the One UI software. It's not going to be much different than the Z Fold 5s, but there are a few cool things that were added AI-wise. My favorite one was actually the AI Doodle, is what I'm calling it. So you get to draw on either a photo or into a drawing app that they have there. And you could use AI to create what you drew, but like in a realistic format or a good format, because my drawing skills are trash. And let me tell you, it's actually pretty good. It's not always understanding what I'm drawing, but I can't really blame AI for that. That's just my personal skill is not great. But it actually blends it in really nicely. And even though it's not something that's going to be used all the time, I probably spent a good 2 hours messing with a photo, just adding things on it, cracking up, playing around. It's a good entertainment source. So, and I can actually see it being useful in certain situations. Like I remember someone had mentioned, that they draw out their thumbnails for YouTube. So that would be a good way to do it. You draw it out there. It creates a somewhat realistic looking thumbnail, and it's gonna make it easier to kind of create your thumbnail based on that. So, use cases like that, it'll be very useful. For me, it's just fun, and I actually enjoyed it quite a bit. But along with some cool new AI features, the phone is actually coming with 7 years of software support. That one, I don't see the point of it. I mean, I guess they want to match the other lineups, that's fine, but I don't see one of these phones lasting 7 years. If it does, great, maybe a few of them will, but I think most of them are probably gonna be in pretty bad shape by that point. The issue with that is I think they use that extra 2 years of support to raise the price $100. That kind of seems to go in line with the other phones where they raised it a little bit and they also added the 7 years. So it just seems like a way to kind of make it seem like it's okay to raise it $100, but the price went up $100. It still sucks. And honestly, I'll be surprised if even half of these phones are around at that time. One thing that came to mind is that I would bet that most people that buy these phones are tech enthusiasts that just love the newest tech. And I don't think many of them are going to be staying with this phone longer than 3 years, maybe 4, before they upgrade to the next one because they want to have the newest things. For the people that keep the phone 7 years, I pretty much guarantee 99% of them are going to be using the slab phones and not these phones. Alright, so I said a lot of great things about this phone. I do really like it, but now I want to go over the items that I think need to be updated in the next generation. The first one is the charging speeds. 25 watts is just not enough for a phone in this price range. For whatever excuse that Samsung might have for it, I don't see why they don't have at least the 45 watt charging that they have on the Ultra models. It might not be something that's necessary, 99% of the time, but being able to charge a phone within 1 hour is a benefit to anyone that needs it at the moment. I can kind of see where they want to save the battery, but there's ways to do it without, actually limiting the charging speeds to 25 watts. So what I do with the S24 Ultra is that I set up a routine to turn off the fast charging when I'm charging overnight. And so it's going to take like 4 hours to charge, and that's perfectly fine because it's going to be ready by the time I wake up. And at the same time, it's saving the battery because it's not pumping in 45 watts at a time. Plus, Samsung already has a battery protect feature, so there's no reason why this phone doesn't have 45 watts of charging. The next one is the camera specs. And this one, I'm a little bit more forgiving than I probably should be because, just the price of the phone screams that it should have the best cameras. But the thing is that with the thinner form factor, it could be a little bit difficult to put in larger sensors. And if you compare the OnePlus Open, it has a huge camera bump compared to the Z Fold 6, and Samsung might just not want to have such big camera bumps. However, that doesn't mean that they have to stick with the same sensors that they currently have. They could come up with a slightly bigger sensor, especially for the telephoto, which is super weak. And they can have a slightly bigger sensor fitted in there and just not have it be as big as the Ultra models. Either way, I feel the cameras need to be upgraded in the next generation because I think people are getting fed up with having the same sensors for so long. And the last item that I have on my list that needs to be updated in the next generation or so is the screen resolution. Funny enough, I actually don't see too many people complain about it, but when I look at the specs, it's actually lower in pixels per inch than the base S24 model. And this phone is over $1,000 more than the base S24 model. So the inner screen, I think, had about 370 pixels per inch, and it needs to be above 400, preferably above 450. The resolution looks good to me, but that number I think is important, especially when you're paying so much money. So even though the phone didn't have a major spec overhaul, it still had a major design change, and that's enough for me to consider it a major update. It's not to say that I wouldn't love a better camera, a shallower crease, and better resolution. But going back to what I said earlier, I noticed that every other industry works the same way. When they release a major design change, they never upgrade the specs of the item. So I'm not surprised that this phone has basically the same specs with a brand new design. So my hope is that Samsung will use the same design or a similar design for the next 3 or 4 years like they did with the previous generation. But instead of focusing on the design, they can start focusing on spec bumps, and hopefully they start improving those things. Even with the specs now being improved, I still consider this to be a great phone, and currently it's my favorite design, and that's including slab phones and flip phones as well. It's just the cleanest design and just makes the most sense from any of the phones that I've used so far. Let me know your thoughts about the Z Fold 6 in the comments. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.